IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to All Things Policy. The fiscal situation of the states in India has been in the news. Last year, against the backdrop of the Sri Lankan financial crisis, the RBI did a risk analysis of India's state finances, and it flagged that many states have a high gross fiscal deficit and the debt levels are also high. They tend to be unsustainable. Also, there seems to be a trend where many states are reverting to not so fiscally sensible, prudent policies. What will all this lead to? How can this be addressed? This is what we are going to discuss today. And joining me for this episode is a special guest. He has been at the forefront of policy ideas, governance reforms. I have with me Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. I know he doesn't need any introduction, but here's a quick intro that will be a great start. So Dr. JP is a physician by training. He has been an integral part of the bureaucracy. He served as an Indian Administrative Services officer. He has also been a lawmaker from Andhra Pradesh, and he has built institutions, Lok Satta, Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Dr. JP, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you, Sarthak. Pleasure to be with you.
So Dr. JP, recently, along with your team at the Foundation for Democratic Reforms, you have been working on a paper to create a politically viable framework for fiscal prudence. And in fact, I have had the privilege to get a quick preview of the same. So my first question, why have you chosen public finance, right? You have done a bunch of things, right, in your career. So why public finance? What is the reason for this?
Great question, Sarthak. No, I actually have no credentials in public finance. I did not study economics. I was never a finance secretary or something. I, of course, ran a cooperative Apex bank. I should say honestly that the bank thrived despite me, not because of me. It was a miracle that it survived a crisis way back in 1989-90. So the reason why I went into that is I've joined this enterprise to transform Indian politics and governance some 30 years ago, outside the government 27, 28 years ago, with great optimism. You know, you're a technology student. Those of us with technology background, we tend to be very rational. We go by evidence, we go by logic, we have a practical solution based on best practices, and presto, it must happen, period. We don't see the gap between a solution being intellectually or rationally available and it being practically implementable in a complex system. So I started with the notion that within 5 years, India will be transformed. Now it's already 27, 28 years for me outside the government. And before that, again, I worked only for transformation. I suspect it will be another 20, 25 years for the kind of robust institutions that we need to build in the country. And there is no appetite for real political reform, namely decentralization of power, genuine decentralization, and electoral system change so that no vote buying and other incentives will be altered, and rule of law, genuine rule of law, not merely normative on paper. All parties are roughly on the same thing. There's no appetite for this kind of a change. But the one thing going good for India is a reasonable prospect of moderately high or high economic growth for the next 20, 30 years. The hope is if that is sustained, 7-8% growth is sustained for the next 25, 30 years. As incomes rise and people become more and more self-reliant and confident, the democracy is a middle class concept base. And we have too many poor with very little hope, and we can't really sustain genuine democracy apart from elections and some freedoms. But if that is undermined by our fiscal management, I think, at least during my lifetime, there is no realistic hope of our democracy becoming better. So when I looked at public finances, there are opportunities and there are grave threats. So I thought that if we don't pay attention to that and do whatever we can to improve it, we'll be failing out.
Yeah. So in fact, in your paper, right, the executive summary actually starts with this, that the most important emerging fault line in India's electoral politics is the choice between long-term growth and short-term political gains, right? So, I was wondering, there are two questions here, right? First is you're saying that this is an emerging failure. And second thing, it is about India's electoral politics. Now, when you say it's an emerging fault line, now I would assume that this is something which is an issue right now. But so that implies that maybe these kind of fault lines did not exist in the past. This kind of dichotomy. Would you agree with that? And secondly, why is it something specific to India? Because these kind of things will be there world over, right? Always there will be a choice between long-term growth and short-term political gains, right? The political parties will try to get the immediate results, right? They will try to have those kind of policies which can possibly get them re-elected. And long-term growth might suffer as a result of that.
Great question, Sarthak. To be truthful, I think this need for reconciliation between the short-term political gain and the long-term public good is universal. It's global in all democracies. I dare say even in dictatorships it's necessary, because in dictatorships, they don't survive through brutal suppression. They require broadly some willing consent. Take China first. Chinese government, even if the Communist Party has a monopoly of power, cannot simply go and beat up people and kill them to retain power. There must be some kind of a company. They must persuade people. There must be willing consent. So it is in that sense global. And two, it's also permanent, particularly in democracies. It's inherent. There is always a temptation to win. And if I lose power by pursuing the right policies, then what's the price of these policies? That's the clash in the minds of the politicians. So I understand. What's happened in India in recent times in particular is a unique situation where a certain line is crossed. I don't think it is really short-term versus long-term. It is short-term and long-term. Particularly in a democracy, you have to simply make it a viable balance. The balance is increasingly missing now. It is shifting in favor of power at any cost. Let the country's long-term growth prospects be damned. And two, one or two decisions are now irreversible and legally binding commitments. Like, for instance, the old unfunded pension system for government employees alone, which is unique to India. And while we have taken some corrective steps some 19, 20 years ago, there's now a temptation to go back to the old ways because of the pressure of a small group of employees organized in government. They constitute 3% of all the workers of the country. 97% of the workers of the country are paying for them for a very generous, unfunded, index-linked, both price index-linked and wage index-linked pension at the cost of the rest of the country, making it entirely unviable. Therefore, in that sense, the danger is imminent. So, but the broader point is completely valid. It's universal, the problem, and it has been permanent. But there are unique situations that make it an imminent threat to the prospects of India's economy. In that sense, I think those sentences you quoted, they are written.
And again, do you see any specific reason why in India these kind of schemes or policy measures are being preferred by different political parties?
Oh, there's a very sound reason. I genuinely believe that as a governance system, we fail to institutionalize true democracy. I know I have to choose my words very carefully.
Yeah.
Democracy means liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of protest and dissent. We are very good at it. We are robust, we are noisy. At the drop of a hat, we indulge in Rasta Rokos, and we shout slogans about we resign, government must resign, government must go. This is habitual in India. That's part of our ethos. And if democracy means voting with great gusto in a festive atmosphere, with tremendous loud noises and voices and celebration, again, we are top. But democracy is so much more. Democracy is about making the ordinary citizen realize the link between her vote and the consequences to her life. We never did that. We always thought of democracy as a normative thing, as a romantic thing, not about the simple bread and butter issues. Like, I always give the example of the apartment in which my office right now is located from where I'm speaking. We pay a monthly maintenance fee.
Yeah.
We all choose, all the apartment dwellers, a group of people like you, bright and smart, and whom we have confidence, trustworthy, who are willing to give time generously. We ask them to take care of the common amenities. They are our leaders. Now, the moment the lift does not function, the moment water supply does not come to my apartment, the moment parking is all helter-skelter downstairs, the moment watch and ward fails and people enter my office without prior permission, I will holler. All the great grand notions of democracy are not what sustains a democracy. These day-to-day things, the link between the vote I give to put this team in place and what happens to me, are they delivering me or not? And the money I pay by way of tax, or in this case, a maintenance fee, whatever, and the services I get. In our democracy, that link has been missing from day one. We built a very highly centralized, dysfunctional, skewed democracy. And therefore, at certain levels, it appears to be working. It actually is working. If democracy means peaceful transfer of power, political competition, regular elections, and political freedoms, yes, of course we have to. But if democracy means more, it means actually understanding what exactly the vote means, what exactly is the tax money and where does it go, then our democracy is incredibly flawed. And once the democracy is flawed and people are not enabled to understand what's there in it for them, I have to give money to get the people into the polling booth. And you are now speaking from Bangalore in Karnataka. I am in Hyderabad and Telangana. Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu are in the same boat. Many of the states are joining these ranks. Without paying money, people will not even come to the polling now, increasing. I'm sure you recognize that. But that is not enough. All parties do the same thing, credible parties which want to get power. Therefore, the short-term delivery of things that don't improve the lot of the people in the long term, but immediately in the short term, they ameliorate the pain of poverty. But they don't end poverty, they don't enhance capacity, they don't increase the earning capacity, they don't make lives better. So that became a necessity for political parties. But the tragedy is if necessity becomes permanent at the cost of economic development without the balance, that's when we have danger. Because let's face it, even a country like America, what did Joe Biden do? He gave mass loan waivers for all the college kids, or erstwhile college kids for the loans they incurred for education, or some other freebies, $1,400 into the pockets of the people on the ground that will somehow stimulate the economy. That did not stimulate the economy in the short term. In the long term, that led to inflation. And I'm sure you are all doing much greater analysis of this. So freebies in some form or other are short-term welfare measures necessary in a democracy to carry everybody with us. The issue is not whether they should be there or not, whether should there be a reasonable balance to protect the long term. I think in India, the ratio has now shifted. The long term, be damned, has now become increasingly endemic in many states, and we are in serious danger.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. JP, for this fascinating insight. So, given that you are talking about short-term political measures here, right? Now, again, all the short-term political measures might not be at the same level, or they might not be as damaging, right? So, in recent times, again, there have been announcements about different short-term political measures, and in some cases, some states have gone ahead and implemented it. For example, OPS that you just mentioned. Now, if you have to compare all these different kinds of short-term political measures, right? For example, OPS or different other individual short-term measures, right? For example, things which are for maybe poverty alleviation or for mitigating the impact of poverty, free food grains, old age pensions. So if you compare these measures, right, which ones do you think are the most damaging? How would you rate all these measures?
Very good question. Let's take the individual short-term welfare measures first. I'm not talking about pension or OPS now.
Yeah.
There are three broad categories. Some you can do it better by more rational analysis, but a crude analysis. One is those that enhance productivity. They're absolutely welcome. I have no doubt. But productivity must be enhanced, not merely production subsidies. Wherever it's possible to enhance productivity through these measures, I think it's necessary. The second kind, inputs to increase production but without enhancing productivity. The farm supply of free power or free water, or fertilizers, etc. They don't enhance productivity really. They simply subsidize input cost of production. Not good enough, but they're still better than straightforward subsidizing of consumption. You talked about free food grains. Yes, in extreme poverty, you can't allow people to be in hunger. And therefore, nutrition, some other needs you have to take care of. And the survival needs of the people at the margins, we must take care of. So there are three levels of the individual social measures: productivity linked, inputs for production, and straightforward consumption subsidies. And obviously, you have to have a reasonable proportion to deal with them. But there are some others which are altogether different. They don't enhance productivity or production. They make it completely unviable in the long term. Old pension scheme is a classic example. I'm sure many of your listeners, they have some understanding, but just so that we're all on the same page, very quickly, world over, we have a social security. What is the difference between those social security programs and our old pension scheme in India? Those programs are universal. Take United States, Britain, Germany, Japan, France. All the working people get the benefit of social security programs. They are fully or substantially funded. The employee and the employer, private sector or government, they put away every month X amount of money in a fund, grows over time, and from that fund, the social security after retirement comes, and therefore there's no burden in the future.
Yeah.
These are the two significant things. What is happening in India? 3% of the workers in government they alone get unfunded, generous, index-linked pension. So much so, somebody who retired with 10 or 15,000 rupees monthly wage might actually get 80 or 90,000 rupees pension. No, I don't begrudge anybody getting some money. But if that is at the cost of the rest of the 97%, if that amount is growing as a proportion of the total tax realization or expenditure of the government or growth rate of the country, then there are very serious danger signals. But that apart from unsustainability, there's another issue. The other social welfare programs, they theoretically, though politically it's going to be a hard struggle, but that's what leadership is about. You can always stop them. There is no legal long-term commitment except a few things like, for instance, your Food Security Act or your Employment Guarantee Act. And B, they can be restructured by a government. C, as the poverty declines, as incomes rise, you can always target it better so that the overall commitment comes down. Whereas the old pension system kind of a thing is an irrevocable legal liability burdening the future generation without the current fund. Because individual social measures you're spending today, you're allocating today from the tax money, you know what is the problem. The cost is not concealed. In projects like old pension system, the costs are concealed, the catastrophe is inevitable, but postponed to tomorrow. Some people can see it, most others ignore it. And ultimately, when the disaster strikes, there's no escape.
Yeah, I mean, also the quantum, right? All the different other social security measures, the quantum, the size is quite less, right? But when it comes to the OPS, some of the estimates point out that it is somewhere around 4 to 5 lakh per annum on an individual. That also is a huge thing, right?
Quantum not only is not very great, it also diminishes over time. Supposing states like Andhra Pradesh and many other southern states have extraordinary short-term welfare measures. But however big they are, in a growing economy with, let's say, 6 or 7% growth rate and 4 or 5% inflation, with a 12% compounded annual nominal growth rate, to that extent the revenues also will rise. Supposing the government has at least some wisdom to not allow the short-term welfare measures, the cost to grow at the same level. Even if it grows at a less level. Over a period of time, it becomes more manageable. Whereas pension burden actually is growing as a share of revenues compared to economic growth, nominal growth, as a share of the total revenues of the states, including government transfers, etc. From 4.7% of the total revenues, it grew to now 15% of the total revenues, including government of India transfers. If you take the state's own revenues, from about 11%, it has grown now to 29%, 27, 28%. So the rate of growth is so pronounced, and people who understand economics and compound interest rate and the graphs, they understand it's going to be a disaster. So there's a whole lot of difference between the short-term individual welfare measures and something like the old pension system, which is both unfunded and growing exponentially. In the last 17 years, from 2004 to 2021, in 17 years, the state's pension burden went up 11 times. 17 years, 11 times. I think anybody who has a sense of numbers must not be able to sleep in the nights. And believe me, in the last few months, I was not able to sleep most of the nights.
Yeah, so basically there is no limit. It's a permanent liability and the quantum is huge. And as you mentioned, it is going to be a disaster. Now, yes, when you look at the finances, the economy, it is going to be a disaster. But do you think there will also be some political, social ramifications of this thing in the future?
Inevitably, the states can no longer borrow. Because ultimately, the union government has the responsibility to preserve and protect the credit of the Union of India. I'm using the Constitution.
Yes.
And the financial stability of India. So most of our assumptions are really theoretical. After a point, there's no longer any debt possible. Therefore, there has to be curtailment of expenditure. If you cannot curtail the pension expenditure, you curtail the other expenditure. Either the basic services, even the rudimentary rule of law that we have, or an absolutely substandard education that we have in the country. We all know about the appallingly poor outcomes of education. And of course, healthcare is even worse, also unfunded or underfunded. At least education is reasonably funded, but very poor delivery. This will get even worse. And of course, your short-term welfare measures also, there's no money left. So there will be an enormous crisis well before it becomes simply unaffordable. Because it becomes unaffordable because the debt is no longer possible. Government of India will then have to invoke necessarily the financial emergency. All hell will break loose. There will be political chaos, there will be social chaos, there will be, of course, economic chaos. A disaster is awaiting us.
Yeah, so this is a grim picture. But what we'll do is we'll just take a quick break and we'll look at some of the solutions, what can be done better. And in fact, your paper talks about some politically viable measures that we can take up at this point of time, maybe to mitigate the grim reality that we might have to face in future. So let's have a quick break. We'll meet again in a couple of minutes to discuss the solutions. So before the break, we were just talking about what can happen if you are not fiscally prudent. So Dr. JP, you have come up with a framework to ensure fiscal prudence. Now, before we go into the details, right, what all should be done, I had a basic question. What are some of the principles on the basis of which we should ideally have a framework for fiscal prudence, right? What should be the underlying basic fundamentals?
Great question. We are a democracy, and we are a strong federal democracy, notwithstanding some deficits here and there. I think in the last 30 years, we matured a great deal as a federal polity. Those who saw the 1980s would realize how far we have come in improving our federal. Therefore, you have to respect the sovereignty of the states and the mandates given by the people. The elected government must have the freedom. Therefore, any rules that you incorporate must be having overall impact on the way we spend, must not go into nitty-gritty of what we spend it on, what project is right, what is wrong, what is a short-term welfare measure, what is not. I think it's impossible to build a consensus, not exactly in a democracy. So the first principle is preserve federalism. Second is recognize that there has to be a balance among various interests and see that it becomes viable. Third is uniform application. Government of India or somebody else does it. After all, they all have a political, they come from a political party or a combination of political parties. And if the bureaucracy directly under the control of them enforces them, even if they don't do it in an unfair manner, there's always a suspicion. Once you have a suspicion, credible suspicion, it's impossible to carry conviction. Therefore, there has to be an independent mechanism. A credible mechanism. And fourth, there must be acceptance of the numbers. And people like you or independent organizations must be able to come up with numbers and say this is what the number is. Otherwise, everybody touts numbers. And for a country that invented decimal system, we are somewhat reckless about numbers. We have more respect for numbers. We are very loose and fast about figures. So somebody must do that thorough analysis in a credible manner and give out those numbers. I think once these 4-5 principles are understood, we can set things right.
Okay, so now again, this is the broader framework, right? But what are the exact policy recommendations that you have, right, to ensure that these principles can be followed in coming up with that policy?
Sarthak, before that, just one brief part. Initially, in the first question itself, you mentioned Government of India. You mentioned states being in crisis.
Yeah.
Many people somehow in states and in the media think that if states are in trouble, all you require is go to Government of India, they'll open a tap and funds will flow.
Yeah.
I think that notion we must disabuse all of us of. There is no money with Government of India either. There is a crisis in Government of India also. If you take the pensions and salaries of Government of India and the interest payments and the transfers to states, these 4 items, all kinds of transfers to states, already Government of India is in deficit. Many people don't know that. Like other revenue expenditure, we are showing about 8 lakh crores, 8 trillion rupees are there about the revenue deficit. But even without that, without spending a rupee on any public good, transfers to states, pensions and salaries and interest, pensions, salaries, there's no discussion. Already Government of India is in deficit. There's a structural deficit. So to pretend or to believe somehow that there is a way out of this, and if only politically we manage this, politically when there's an answer, I think we must get it up. Now, what can be done? Luckily, our constitution makers are very wise. They understood, as I mentioned before, that in a federal polity, when the states have sovereignty and should have sovereignty, and there must be decentralized governance, the broader issues of the financial stability of India and the credit of the Union of India, they are federal issues. They are not state issues. And that's why in India, a state cannot go bankrupt. Unlike in the US, no, you hear of a state going bankrupt, Detroit City going bankrupt, and so on and so forth. In India, it is federal. Recognizing that, the Constituent Assembly created a wonderful framework. Article 293 gives that framework. What it says is that if you incur a debt, it must take prior consent of the government, in simple words. Every debt must obtain prior consent. And the states always will incur debts. And the states always have to take the prior concurrence because states also owe money to government. Not only do the government of India have to approve that, government of India under Article 293, Subarticle 4, have the duty to impose such conditions as are necessary, not arbitrary conditions, not political conditions, but to retain the credit of the Union of India and to preserve the financial stability. Reasonable conditions. You use these two provisions and you make the revenue deficit what many economists call the golden rule, that you cannot borrow for the current expenditure. After all, what does the family do? Your family, my family, your parents, my parents, even in a poor country because they were thrifty, what little income they had, they consumed, but they saved something, but they never borrowed for consumption as a general. So
typically borrowing is for some assets, right? Maybe you want to
an asset,
purchase a house or something.
Absolutely. So if you simply have that rule, even if you can't enforce it overnight, take 2-3 years in the states and the union to come back, because there's a structuring deficit at the union level. So it may take some time. But if you go in that direction and finally say, henceforth there shall be no borrowing for current expenditure. And if you create an independent body, some people call it fiscal council. My own preference is make the finance commission a permanent body because I don't believe in too many bodies. Utilize an existing credible body and give them this task also of enforcing the fiscal rules. And also create a body like, you call it Office of Budget Responsibility in Britain, you call it Congressional Budget Office in the US. Basically, an independent body with the professional skills and expertise to do the detailed calculations of all the policies and programs and their implications to the fiscal future. Because somebody must have credible set of numbers that can be trusted, and we all agree upon. If you don't agree on numbers to my mind, I'm sure you agree, they're sacred. If on numbers you don't agree, then all discussion in public policy fails. So somebody must come up with a credible number which can't be disputed. So once we have this framework, we have the ability. Now, what do we do with the 5-6 states which have not embraced OP, the National Pension System, the funded system, which created in 2004? And one state that never, or the 5 states that have gone back to OPS. West Bengal never embraced the funded pension system, national pension system. And 5 states, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, and Punjab and Himachal Pradesh, they have now gone back to old pension system, unfunded pension system. For your listeners, just one sentence, because I don't think we discussed that. What the national pension system brought about by Vajpayee government and very vigorously pursued by the Manmohan Singh government all over the country was that they will be funding, employee will put X amount of money and employer will put X amount of money, and there will be pension drawn from this fund which grows over a period of time and is growing in a very healthy manner. Right now we have roughly about 10 lakh crores, 10 trillion rupees in the fund. Is growing by 20-25% every year. Now, the important thing is this is applicable, the national pension system, the funded pension system, only for employees recruited after 2004.
Yeah.
Now, because they were all recruited after 2004 with this pension system. Unilaterally, some political parties, because they're afraid of a small number of organized workers who understand their interests and they're organized, they're vocal, they're powerful, they're showing their muscle and parties are yielding. They're scared. Whereas the 97% people whose money is going to fund the generous pensions of these 3% people, 25 years later, 30 years later, at the cost of our children, that nobody is taking as a problem. Therefore, the people who should worry about it, they're not worried about it. And they're not fighting for it. Therefore, the support from them is at best lukewarm. Whereas the opposition or the pressure to go back to OPS from this small organized sector is very formidable. And that's where the challenge is. So unless we do something about these 6 states, we have a problem. So what do? A simple thing. You can have any pension you want, but fund it today. Don't transfer the burden to the next generation. You have no right to consume the services today and ask the next generation taxpayer, your children, to pay from their salaries in an unaffordable, unsustainable manner. It's immoral, it's unjust, unsustainable, it affects intergenerational equity, it destroys the finances. Therefore, you have a sinking fund, put the money today. And for debt calculations, you treat it as a public debt. World over, they treat it as a public debt. And therefore, you talked about public debt. Now, states, under fiscal rules, the ceiling must be 20% of the GST pay the state. Most states are now at 38, 40. States like Rajasthan are at 50, 55% already of the GST. Unsustainable.
So this is an interesting thing, right? That and ideally, this is what should happen, right? Those who are deciding, those who are benefiting, those who are paying, right? There should be some sort of overlap between them. But in this old pension scheme, what is happening? Those who are benefiting and those who are paying for that benefit, they're different, right? You are at present, whoever are the government employees, they will retire, they will benefit, but the burden of their pension will fall on some future generations. So to ensure fiscal prudence, I would suggest that there should be this maximum overlap between these three things, right? Who takes the decision, who benefits, and who pays. So old pension scheme doesn't allow for that. Now, Dr. JP, I had like a couple of questions related to a few of the things that you mentioned in the beginning. So, for example, you said the revenue deficit should be zero and revenue deficit grant should not be provided to the states. Now, there are some states in India, because of, let's say, their physical conditions, geographical conditions, right? They have some limitations, right? For example, the hilly states or the northeastern states, right? The cost of providing different services to their people will be high, will be expensive. And at the same time, it might be difficult for them to generate enough revenues, right? So if we do not provide them revenue deficit grants, then how will things be for them?
Great question, Sarthak. In a country of tremendous regional disparities, we must address the needs of the sub-regions of India. I'm absolutely with you on that. Bihar has very low per capita income for no fault of the people. Unless we take care of them as a country, what will happen to them?
Yeah.
And if Bihar eventually collapses, it will be a collapse of India. I am pretty clear in my mind. But the way to address that is not to encourage fiscal profligacy and irresponsible policies and then fund the deficit blindly, but to address these issues in the fund allocation. For instance, Government of India transfers to the states through the Finance Commission, the Constitutional Devolution, and through the centrally sponsored schemes and other programs, about 20 lakh crores. Most people don't realize. Now, in that, there are two kinds. One is Finance Commission. Already, the special category states, they are taken apart. Their population is only about 8 crores in India. They live in states. And yet, 30% of the total allocation of the transfers goes to those 8 states, or those 11 states. And people of India are quite happy with that. That's been a practice for a long time. So you already address the backwardness, the geography, the terrain, and the distance they have to travel. In addition, many of the centrally sponsored schemes, what are they? Some may be universal, but some others are really benchmarks. Take health programs. For X population, there must be a benchmark. A PhD should be there, some other things should be there. It is to meet that deficit that these programs are supposed to fund. So that's already embedded in the resource transfer. That's the way it should be. But if you make it merely, if you have a deficit, I'll anyway fund you. No, I will incur a deficit not to provide better services or to reduce backwardness, because I would want to give a politically popular short-term individual benefit. Like, for instance, some states suddenly go for a loan waiver. Now, you want to go for a loan waiver, and the deficit incurred on account of that, the union government is funding, therefore the taxpayers of all of India are spending. And the other states are responsible. They want to give better governance. They don't want to go for loan waiver, and they are forced to pay the penalty for you, and you have no penalty at all. So where is fiscal responsibility there? So we must address the needs of backwardness, no question about it, and historical legacy. But by other means, resource transfers and by benchmarking in the resource transfers, not by funding the deficit. And I'll give you a concrete example. When Andhra Pradesh and Telangana division took place, the government of India gave a legal commitment that for 5 years they will meet the revenue deficits. They actually said resource gap. I argued publicly and in writing, though I come from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, from these two states. I was born actually in the current day Andhra Pradesh. I grew up there. I said it's wrong to fund the loan waiver program government has deliberately taken. It is their problem. If you are irresponsible, you pay for that. How can you ask the people of India to pay? And that's what prevailed ultimately. I said that must be taken out of the calculation of the revenue deficit.
Okay, yeah.
So
that makes sense.
No
Yeah. I mean, perfectly makes sense. Now, you also talked about benchmarking, and you talked about two institutions, right? Fiscal Council and the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, I have two, again, related questions. Now, how these two institutions will be different in terms of their responsibility, because again, both of them are trying to calculate numbers. They're trying to give some ballpark numbers, right? And second thing is there any possibility that in future, the way these institutions operate, because they will be the ones who will now decide how much the different states are going to get resources, right? Finances. So is there a possibility that these institutions might be captured and maybe some states will be discriminated against the cost of others? How can we balance that? First of all, is there any such fear? And how do you ensure that those kind of things can be taken care of?
In a democracy like ours, there is always a potential risk of excessive politicization. That's why, A, we must go by the bad practice. And B, I'm a great believer in utilizing existing strong and credible institutions rather than creating new ones. Take the Finance Commission, or in a different context, take the Election Commission, the Supreme. With all the deficiencies and occasion, on the whole, there's credibility. Take the Union Public Service Commission, there is trust. So it's better to utilize these institutions rather than try and create new institutions and hope that they'll do better. Second is you must separate the data crunching, the number crunching, and coming out with the data, accurate data, from the enforcement of the fiscal. So what we have in mind, what many people recommend, I think originally here, for instance, I think the 10th Finance Commission onwards, they've been recommending a fiscal council. So you have a fiscal council, or I would actually prefer the Finance Commission taking up that role. There is nothing that prevents the Finance Commission from becoming a permanent body, because the credibility of the Finance Commission, by and large, is now established in the country. We've now had 14 Finance Commissions, I think 15 Finance Commissions. We're going to have 16th one very soon. By and large, all over the country, notwithstanding some political polemics, we all respect those numbers, right? And the awards of the Finance Commission are taken as awards. Actually, they are recommendations. One great thing about independent India is every government, irrespective of party at the federal level, has accepted that as more or less an award. Therefore, whatever formula they are given is embraced by the government and they transfer it. So it has a high degree of credibility. There is expertise. Make it a permanent body. And for other purposes, call it a fiscal council to enforce the rules. That which state is where and what is the rule to be applied, whether or not this loan should be approved, or what conditions should be imposed in order for the government to have fiscal responsibility. And they must also apply the same principle to union government. While they cannot bully union government because they have no constitutional mechanism, but they're publicly advising them and telling the parliament itself will become an important guide and public discussion will take place. But in order to help them, either in the Finance Commission or some other body or independently separate, some office whose duty is number crunch, supposing the policy is proposed by a major political party. What are its implications? Suppose somebody is going for an old pension system. What will actually happen 5 years hence, 10 years hence, in a credible way, in a professional way, based on data, accurate analysis, sometimes actuarial numbers, sometimes real expenditure, and states increasingly are resorting to fudging their accounts. I'm using this very advisory. They are showing off-budget loans. Very significant amounts. Many states, it now reaches about 6 to 8% of the GSDP. If they are incurring, their tax officially is 35-38%, actually that is including off-budget loans for which there is no revenue stream. Directly, government has to fund it anyway. It's 45 or 50%. And some states are doing constitutionally very dangerous things. Directly, they're creating escrow account on the government revenues. And revenue account money that should go constitutionally into the exchequer, the treasury, is directly flowing into the creditor. Unthinkable if a constitution is working properly. And there's another thing happening, even beyond this. Tens of thousands of crores in state after state, there are unpaid bills. These are liabilities which cannot be ignored. Contracting, the work is completed, you have to pay the bills. Because contractors are afraid of the government, they simply swallow it in silence. Eventually, they go to court if things go beyond the point. So again, they're concealing the expenditure by not showing the budget at all. So all these, somebody independently must take into account with the legal authority to simply calculate and make public, so that the Fiscal Council or Finance Commission can take informed decisions, and the legislatures at the state and national level will have full information. And people like you and I have the basis on which we discuss. If the numbers, again, as I said before, if we don't accept the numbers, then there's a problem.
Yeah. So again, all these recommendations that you have, right? So some of these things might not be, let's say, palatable to certain existing entrenched stakeholders, right? But for any policy to be successful when it comes to their implementation, I would assume that it has to be politically viable as well, right? There has to be some legitimacy. In fact, you mentioned that the recommendations are part of a politically viable fiscal prudence framework. So now my question is, do you think all these things are politically viable, or do we need to do something to make it politically viable?
No, once the issues are known to people, Sarthak, every group in the country would be on board. There are two groups which are special concerns, not political parties. In their case, fear. I think every sensible political party understands the problem. Whatever we discuss, they may not know in granular detail, but I can guarantee every MLA, every MP of the country, every serious political leader of every political party understands this. Where they resort into short-termism? Fear. Fear of a small section of organized vocal electorate and their power over the polling booths, and they may hurt you in the elections. Because the rest of the people are either ignorant or silent. So the way to address that is, if the rest of the people, out of the 54 crore workers in the country, we may take 52 crores, your numbers are as well as mine, but somewhere of that order, 54 to 54 crores total workers in the country. Only about 3% are thereabout, or 3.2% are in the governments. 97% are outside. Of them, at least 10-15% are paying the taxes now, direct taxes. Apart from indirect taxes, everybody paying. If the direct taxpayers, they understand what is actually happening, then the political parties realize being afraid of 3%, being unafraid of 10% who are not aware is stupid political. We can address it by simple facts.
Yeah.
The second group is employees themselves. After all, if I am offered a better deal, let the country be damned, I benefit, why not take it? I don't blame them. Therefore, we must also address their concerns come to middle pack. For instance, if they feel that, the pension fund to which they contribute and the employers contribute, if that is invested in a very risky manner, you make it nothing. I think they dissuade those concerns to have some reasonable proportion of, risk appetite funds and non-risk appetite funds. We can even go to the extent of doing some calculation and saying, all right, current level, given the past 15, 20 years experience, this is the kind of pension that is likely. And perhaps the government can underwrite a certain floor. There's no floor in the current national pension system. We can think of it as long as it's fiscally reasonable. That's okay. So there are ways of addressing that so that the bulk of the employees, they see the fairness of it. And the legitimate concerns they may have, the genuine fears they may have, they are addressed. And also, there's a lot of misinformation. And the national pension system, the funded pension system, contributory pension system, not only do they get pension, and perhaps a better pension than they fear because India is growing fast, and therefore the stock market and other avenues of investment actually they are doing pretty well so far. And it's likely to do reasonably well in the coming future. But they also get something they would not get in the old pension system. They would actually get lump sum money after the demise of the employee. It's like your property, it's your money. You not only get pension as long as you're alive and your dependent family members are alive after you. That money goes back to your family. And that part is talked about. So once they understand it, I think you can also address that.
In fact, I can add one more point here. In fact, if you go ahead with old pension scheme, right, many other states, they also start implementing it. It might so happen that the government employees in future might not get benefits because like we see in the case of Agniveer and all, right, if the pension burden keeps on increasing, the states might now be incentivized to reduce the number of permanent employees or the number of employees who will get the pension and benefits. Maybe they will go for employees who are employed for a very short-term duration. So making them not eligible for these kind of pension benefits, which in turn implies that the number of jobs which give you these benefits goes down.
Great point, Sarthak. You hit the nail on the head. One, happened in Agniveer will happen elsewhere too because the governments can no longer afford to employ pensionable employees. It will be a disaster. And two, even the salaries will be in danger. Already there are many states where salaries and pensions are delayed. Arrears are delayed by a year or two. Employees know that. If it comes to financial emergency, even legally, the government of India will then have a duty to curb pensions and salaries. So they are thinking that this money is available. This money is not available. It's illusory. When it's not available, you will get nothing. You're only hoping that you'll get it at the cost of the rest of India. Things will never go to that level. Ultimately, there will be a financial emergency. Whereas in the funded system, your money is separate from the government finances. That money will not go anywhere. You're always subject to security. You're totally right. You hit the nail on the head. But unfortunately, these are not discussed. Nobody is talking. There's only one voice talking. A certain section of organized employees who are making it a patriotic issue, the language of patriotism, Inkilab, Zindabad, Hamara Hak Hai, that kind of a thing, and misplaced quotations and misplaced sense of fraudulent socialism, because that is how we interpreted socialism in the country. Instead of opportunity for everybody, it is for the organized, privileged sections a wonderful life at the cost of the unorganized sections who are 90% of India's workforce. That's the tragedy of the larger debate in the past 70 years. We're paying a price.
I think this is a great way to possibly end this episode. So, Dr. JP, any concluding thoughts?
Sarthak, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I hope that people start thinking about it. This is based on global experience and hard data. I'm a great optimist. I truly believe that our democracy, while it is very flawed, as I mentioned before, and very dysfunctional in many respects, on the whole, it's a miracle that's still in progress. Because that we retain unity of the country, that we retain freedoms, peaceful transfer of power, and accomplished many extraordinary things like linguistic reorganization, dealing with our diversity very peacefully, and achieved moderate economic growth is a miracle. And right now we have an opportunity, partly because over 30 years the governments have done some things right and the people responded magnificently, partly because the globe wants to see India's prosperity more than even India wants. We sometimes take it for granted. And I think if these issues that we discussed today, they are addressed in an intelligent and a rational and reasonable way. Pragmatic. I believe in pragmatic. I don't believe there's an ideal answer to these problems. An ideal answer which is not workable is no answer at all. If you do it pragmatically, I think we can satisfy all the interests of the people, but protect the future and really create the framework for complete ending of poverty and improving their lives and lifestyles and making India into a truly powerful economic giant, a developed country. But if we bungle now, and as an optimist I'm saying, an incurable optimist, if we bungle now, for a generation of or more, India has no future. And that is something that makes me shake.
Thank
and
you,
I
Dr.
hope that
JP.
we'll do whatever it takes to raise our voice and persuade the political parties. They don't have to be afraid so much. And there's a way of reconciling the short term with the long term.
Thank you, Dr. JP, for the fascinating insights. I think you have given enough food for thought for our listeners. I look forward to reading the final version of your paper. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.